In the soft glow of the early evening, John Davenport wiped the sweat from his brow, his rough hands clinging to the familiar tools of his trade. He'd spent the day fixing up an old farm fence that stretched across a plot of land not far from his modest home. John was a simple man, content with his work, though life hadn't always been kind. His routine was predictable, his days long, and his nights spent dreaming of something more, though he had long since given up on the idea that anything extraordinary would happen to him. It was then that his phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. The screen lit up with a name he didn't recognize, Elaine Montgomery. He hesitated before answering, wiping his hands clean on his jeans. "Hello, Mr. Davenport," a woman's voice said on the other end, smooth and authoritative. "This is Elaine Montgomery. I believe you've heard of me?" He paused. Elaine Montgomery. The name sounded faintly familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "I'm not sure I do," he admitted, his voice gruff from years of outdoor labor. There was a soft laugh on the other end of the line. "You will. I'd like to invite you to a meeting. It's urgent, and I believe you'll find it life-changing." John frowned, unsure of what to make of the request. He was just a worker, someone who fixed things and kept his head down. Why would someone like her, whoever she was, be interested in him? "I think you got the wrong guy," he said, his tone firm but polite. "No mistake, Mr. Davenport. I know exactly who you are. Be at the Montgomery estate tomorrow at noon. I'll send a car for you." Before he could protest, the line went dead. John stared at the phone in disbelief. The Montgomery estate. Now it made sense. Elaine Montgomery, widow of the billionaire industrialist, Nathaniel Montgomery, who had passed away suddenly just a few years ago. Their story had made headlines. His fortune, her mysterious persona, and the wealth she inherited after his death. But what could she possibly want with him? The next morning, John found himself pacing the small living room of his home, the uncertainty gnawing at him. He hadn't slept well, the vague conversation from the night before replaying over and over in his mind. As promised, a sleek black car pulled up outside his house, looking impossibly out of place in the quiet, rural surroundings. The driver, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, stepped out and opened the door for him. "Mr. Davenport," he said with a nod. John hesitated for a brief moment before climbing into the back seat. The door shut with a soft click, and before he knew it, they were heading toward the sprawling Montgomery estate. The drive was silent, giving John too much time to think. What did Elaine Montgomery want with him? He was just a nobody, a simple worker who'd spent most of his life fixing things and making ends meet. The estate loomed in the distance, growing larger with every passing mile. Soon, they were winding through the gates, flanked by tall, iron bars that gave the place an air of impenetrability. When the car finally stopped in front of the grand entrance, John's stomach twisted in knots. He'd never seen such luxury in his life. The mansion looked more like a palace, with towering columns and wide, marble steps leading to massive double doors. The driver motioned for him to step out. "This way, Mr. Davenport," a soft voice called from behind him. John turned to see a woman standing at the base of the steps. She was dressed elegantly but simply, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wasn't much older than John. There was something about her that seemed distant, detached. "I'm Elaine," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "I'm glad you came." John nodded, unsure of what to say. He felt out of place, a worker standing in the middle of opulence, where every stone seemed polished and every surface gleamed. His boots scuffed against the pristine walkway as he followed her inside. They walked in silence through a long corridor, the walls adorned with expensive art and antiques, relics from a life far beyond his own. The tension in the air was thick, as if something unseen was watching, waiting. Finally, they reached a large, dimly lit room with a massive table at its center. Elaine gestured for him to sit, but she remained standing, her arms crossed over her chest. Her expression was unreadable. "Do you know why I asked you here, Mr. Davenport?" "No," John said, his voice sounding smaller than he'd intended. "I've been trying to figure that out." She leaned forward, her gaze intense. "You're here because I need someone who isn't part of my world. Someone who doesn't have any strings attached, someone I can trust." John blinked, completely lost. "Trust me? I don't even know you." Elaine smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "No, you don't. But you will. She paused, her eyes flicking to the door before returning to him. Let me be blunt, Mr. Davenport. My late husband's death was no accident, and I believe the people responsible are much closer than I'd like to think. John's heart began to race. He had no idea where this conversation was heading, but he could feel the weight of the words. The air in the room grew heavier, as though the very walls were closing in. Elaine took a deep breath. I'm offering you a chance to help me. It's dangerous, but the rewards will be beyond anything you can imagine. Money, influence, a life far removed from what you know now. John stared at her, his mind spinning. Why him? Why not someone more qualified, more experienced? His life had been simple up until now, hard work, long days, and modest means. And yet, here he was, being drawn into something that felt far bigger than himself. I don't know what you think I can do, John finally said, his voice low. Elaine's gaze never wavered. That's where you're wrong. You're exactly the kind of person I need, because you're the last person anyone would expect. The words hung in the air, thick with implications John couldn't quite grasp. He had so many questions, but none of them seemed to matter in the moment. There was a sense of inevitability pulling him forward, deeper into something he couldn't understand. And just as he opened his mouth to speak, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps racing toward them. Elaine's eyes widened with alarm. We're out of time, she whispered. John's heart pounded in his chest, the sound of the footsteps sending a cold rush of fear through him. He glanced at Elaine, whose face had tightened with concern. She looked toward the door, then back at him, her expression a mixture of urgency and control. Stay quiet, she whispered, her voice barely audible. John nodded, his mind racing. Whoever was coming clearly wasn't supposed to be here. Was it someone connected to the mysterious death of her husband? Or something else entirely? There was no time to ask questions now. Elaine moved swiftly across the room, pressing a panel on the wall. To John's amazement, a hidden door slid open, revealing a narrow passageway. In here, she ordered softly, motioning for him to follow. John hesitated, but the urgency in her voice left no room for debate. He followed her into the passage, and the door slid shut behind them just as the footsteps grew louder. The narrow hallway was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a single bulb hanging overhead. It smelled of old wood and dust, a stark contrast to the opulence of the rest of the mansion. Elaine led the way, her pace quick but quiet. John's mind reeled with questions. Why did she have a hidden passage in her own home? Who was after them? And what had he gotten himself into by agreeing to come here? After what felt like an eternity, they reached another door at the end of the passage. Elaine pressed her ear against it for a moment, listening. Satisfied, she pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with old books, papers, and a large desk that looked untouched for years. She closed the door behind them and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. We should be safe here for now, she said, her voice a little less tense. John scanned the room, his eyes landing on the piles of papers scattered across the desk. They were yellowed with age, some of them torn, others neatly stacked. Something about the room felt out of place, as if it had been forgotten by time. Elaine caught his gaze and sighed. This was my husband's study. He never used it much, but I come here when I need to think. She paused for a moment, then continued. This house, it's not what it seems. Nathaniel, he was involved in things far more complicated than I ever knew. After his death, I started digging, and what I found. She trailed off, shaking her head as if trying to make sense of it all. John frowned, still unsure what role he was supposed to play in all this. Why me? He asked, his voice steady but filled with confusion. I'm just a worker. What could I possibly do to help you? Elaine met his eyes, and for the first time, John saw a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. Because you're not part of their world. The people involved, they're powerful, connected. They can buy off anyone, control anything. But you're different. You have no ties to this life, no one to manipulate. John took a deep breath, trying to process her words. This was all so far beyond his world. He had spent his life fixing things, keeping to himself, avoiding anything that might complicate his quiet existence. But now, he was standing in a billionaire's secret room, being told that he was somehow part of a dangerous game he barely understood. You mentioned your husband's death wasn't an accident, John said carefully, trying to piece together the puzzle. What happened? Elaine's face darkened, her eyes distant as if recalling something painful. Nathaniel was a brilliant man, but he had secrets. I didn't know the full extent of it until after he was gone. The official story is that he had a heart attack, but I've since learned there were people who wanted him dead. People who needed him out of the way to take control of certain interests. What kind of interests? John asked, leaning in. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the desk. Money, of course, but it's more than that. Power, influence. Nathaniel was involved in deals, investments, things that crossed into very dangerous territory. The kind of territory that makes people disappear. John's stomach churned. He could feel the weight of the situation settling on him, heavy and uncomfortable. He had no idea what he'd gotten himself into, but it was clear this was far more dangerous than he had imagined. Elaine continued, her voice low. I've been trying to uncover the truth about what happened to him, but every time I get close, something happens. People I thought I could trust have turned on me. I've been followed, threatened. That's why I need someone like you, someone who has no connection to this world. John ran a hand through his hair, feeling the gravity of her words. But I don't know how I can help. I'm not a detective or anything like that. You don't need to be, Elaine said, stepping closer. I just need someone who can move unnoticed. Someone they won't suspect. Before John could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. His heart leaped into his throat. Elaine's eyes darted toward the sound, her body tensing. She motioned for John to stay quiet, then moved to open the door a crack. A tall man stood in the doorway, his face shadowed by the dim light. It's me, he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. Elaine sighed with relief and opened the door wider. John, this is David. He's one of the few people I still trust. David stepped into the room, giving John a quick nod before turning his attention back to Elaine. We have a problem, he said, his tone serious. They know you've been digging. They're not happy. Elaine's face hardened. I figured as much. Did you find out how much they know? David shook his head. Not everything, but enough to make them nervous. We need to move quickly if we're going to stay ahead of them. John watched the exchange in silence, the tension between the two palpable. It was clear that whatever they were up against was much bigger than he had imagined. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, but there was no turning back now. Elaine glanced at John, her expression softening for a brief moment. You see why I need your help now? She asked quietly. This isn't just about me. It's about taking down the people who think they can control everything. John nodded slowly, his mind still racing. He didn't know where this was heading. One thing was clear. He was in it now, whether he liked it or not. As the sound of footsteps echoed once again from somewhere within the mansion, the tension in the room grew thicker. The clock was ticking, and whatever was coming next would change everything. John could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him as the footsteps grew louder, closer. David's expression had tightened, his body tense as if ready for whatever was about to happen. Elaine glanced at him, her eyes betraying a flicker of fear before she quickly masked it with the same steely resolve she'd shown earlier. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Whoever was coming knew something, and John wasn't sure he was ready for what might happen next. The walls of the room felt like they were closing in, every breath heavier than the last. The mansion, with its grandeur and silence, suddenly felt like a trap. We need to move, David said, his voice low but urgent. They're not here for a chat. Elaine nodded, her eyes meeting John's for a moment. There was something unspoken between them, a shared understanding that whatever they were facing wasn't going to be easy. John still didn't know all the details, but he could sense the danger was very real. David led them out of the room and down another narrow hallway, this one dimly lit by small sconces on the walls. John's heart raced as they moved quickly, the tension growing with each step. The mansion was a labyrinth, with corridors and hidden rooms, all of it designed to keep secrets buried. They reached another door, and David pushed it open, revealing a stairwell leading down into what looked like the basement. The air was cooler here, damp with the smell of stone and earth. John followed them down the stairs, the faint echo of their footsteps bouncing off the walls. When they reached the bottom, the space opened into a large underground room. It wasn't at all what John had expected. Instead of the dusty, forgotten basement of an old mansion, this room was filled with high-tech equipment. computers, screens, and stacks of papers scattered across tables. It looked like a command center hidden beneath the house, a place where someone could monitor everything without ever being seen. "What is this?" John asked, his voice hushed in disbelief. Elaine glanced at him before walking over to one of the computers. "This is what's left of Nathaniel's work," she said softly. "He built this space to keep an eye on things. Deals, operations, movements, everything. But after he died, I realized it was also where he hid the truth about the people he was working with." John felt a chill run down his spine. It was one thing to hear about shady deals and mysterious deaths, but seeing this hidden world buried beneath the mansion, made it all feel terrifyingly real. David moved to one of the screens and typed something quickly. A series of images flashed across the screen. Documents, photos, emails, all of them connected to Nathaniel and his business empire. It was a web of connections that John couldn't fully understand, but he could see how deep it went. Elaine stood next to him, her face tight with concentration. "Nathaniel had enemies," she explained. "Powerful people who wanted control over what he built. When he refused to play their game, they decided he was better off dead, but he left me enough breadcrumbs to figure out who they are." John stared at the screen, trying to make sense of the information in front of him. Names, numbers, places, it all blurred together, but one thing was clear: whoever these people were, they had influence far beyond anything he'd imagined. David turned to them, his face grim. "They know Elaine's getting close to something. That's why they're here now. They want to stop her before she can expose them." John felt his stomach tighten. This was much more than just some rich widow looking for justice. This was a battle against people who could destroy lives with a phone call. People who wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect their interests. Elaine stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "We don't have much time. They'll be watching everything, my accounts, my movements. I can't do this alone." John looked at her, feeling the weight of her words settle on him. He was just a worker, someone who fixed fences and tried to live a quiet life. But now he was standing in the middle of something that felt too big, too dangerous. And yet, he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when he could see how much was at stake. "You're asking me to risk everything," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elaine nodded, her eyes locked on his. "I am. But you're the only one who can help me now." David moved closer, his voice calm but firm. "We have a plan, but we need someone who can move under the radar. Someone they won't see coming." John didn't know what to say. His mind was racing, but there was a part of him, a quiet part that had always longed for something more, that knew this was it. This was the moment his life would change, one way or another. Before he could speak, a loud bang echoed through the stairwell behind them. The sound sent a jolt of fear through the room. John's eyes widened as David moved quickly to the computer, pulling up security footage from the mansion's entrance. "They've found the passage," David said, his voice tight with alarm. "We need to go now." Elaine grabbed a small black case from one of the tables, her movements quick and efficient. "We'll take the back exit," she said. "They don't know about it." John followed them, his heart pounding as they moved swiftly through another hidden door at the far end of the room. The air grew colder as they descended deeper underground, the stone walls pressing in around them. As they reached the exit, Elaine turned to John, her expression serious. "After this, there's no turning back," she said softly. "If you walk away now, you'll be safe, but if you stay, you'll be in it for the long haul." John swallowed hard, his mind racing. He could leave now, go back to his quiet life and pretend none of this had ever happened. But something inside him, a spark of curiosity, of resolve, made him hesitate. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away. "I'm in," he said, his voice steady. Elaine nodded, her face unreadable. "Then let's go." The door creaked open, revealing a dark tunnel that stretched out into the unknown. The tension in the air was thick, every step they took filled with the weight of what was to come. As they disappeared into the darkness, John couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. And whatever lay ahead would be far more dangerous than anything he could have imagined. The tunnel was cold, the air damp and heavy. John could hear the distant echo of their footsteps, the only sound in the oppressive silence. Every nerve in his body was on edge, his senses alert to the slightest movement. He knew they were being chased, hunted by people who wouldn't hesitate to kill if they got too close. The wake of his decision to stay was sinking in now, but there was no turning back. Not anymore. Elaine led the way, her pace steady but quick, as if she walked this hidden path before. Behind them, David kept a watchful eye, his hand never far from the gun tucked under his coat. John had no idea where they were going, only that it felt like they were running out of time. Each step felt heavier than the last, the tension between them thick, unspoken. "They'll be expecting us to head for the main exit," Elaine whispered, her voice barely audible in the dark. "But there's another way out, a route Nathaniel set up in case things ever went south." John wasn't surprised. Everything about Nathaniel's life seemed to be built on layers of secrets. Even in death, he was pulling the strings from beyond the grave, his plans unfolding through the maze of tunnels and hidden passages. John couldn't help but wonder how much of this Elaine had known before her husband's death, and how much she was only discovering now, piece by piece. The tunnel opened up into a larger chamber, the air cooler and tinged with the faint smell of gasoline. John noticed the faint glow of light ahead, the first sign they were getting closer to the surface. Elaine glanced back at him, her expression unreadable, before moving toward a metal door on the far side of the chamber. John's pulse quickened as she pushed it open, revealing a small garage hidden beneath the mansion. 2 black SUVs sat parked inside, their engines silent but ready. It was the perfect escape route, hidden, untraceable, but something didn't feel right. John couldn't shake the gnawing sensation that they were walking into a trap. David moved ahead, checking the vehicles with quick, practiced movements. "We're clear," he said, his voice tight with tension. "We need to move fast." Elaine moved toward one of the SUVs, her movements smooth and deliberate, but John hesitated. The feeling of being watched, of being just one step behind their enemies, was stronger now. He glanced around, his eyes scanning the shadows of the garage, looking for anything out of place. "John," Elaine called softly, her voice pulling him back. "We need to go." He nodded, forcing himself to focus, and moved toward the SUV. But just as his hand touched the door handle, a faint click echoed through the room, a sound that sent a jolt of fear through him. "Get down!" David shouted, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. Before John could react, the room exploded into chaos. Bullets tore through the air, the sound deafening as they ricocheted off the walls and vehicles. John hit the ground, his heart pounding in his chest as the world seemed to tilt around him. He could hear the sharp crack of gunfire, the shouts of men closing in, and the roar of engines as the SUVs screeched to life. Elaine was already behind the wheel, her face pale but focused as she threw the vehicle into gear. "Get in," she screamed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. John scrambled to his feet, dodging a spray of bullets as he threw himself into the passenger seat. David was already in the back, returning fire through the shattered window. The tires squealed as Elaine floored the gas pedal, the SUV lurching forward and crashing through the metal garage door. The world outside exploded into motion. Bright headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, winding road that led away from the mansion. Behind them, John could hear the roar of engines as their pursuers gave chase, their headlights cutting through the trees like ghostly eyes. "Hold on," Elaine shouted, her voice tight with adrenaline as she swerved around a sharp curve. John gripped the seat, his knuckles white as they sped down the road, the sound of gunfire and screeching tires filling the air. He could feel the tension building, the danger closing in from all sides. They were being hunted, and there was no clear way out. David cursed under his breath, reloading his gun as he leaned out the window to fire at the pursuing vehicles. "We can't keep this up," he growled, his voice filled with frustration. "They got the advantage." Elaine didn't respond, her eyes focused on the road ahead, her face set in determination. She was pushing the SUV to its limits, weaving through the narrow roads with a skill that left John both impressed and terrified. He didn't know how much longer they could keep this up, but he knew they were running out of options. "We need to lose them," Elaine said, her voice strained. "There's an old quarry up ahead. If we can make it there, we might be able to hide." John glanced back at David, whose face was grim but resolute. "It's a risk," he said, "but it's our only shot." The SUV careened around another sharp turn, the headlights of their pursuers growing closer with each passing second. John could see the cold determination in their eyes, the men behind the wheel relentless, like sharks closing in for the kill. Elaine slammed on the brakes as they approached the entrance to the quarry, the tires skidding on the gravel road as the SUV slid into the shadows of the massive rock formations. For a moment, everything was silent, the darkness swallowing them whole. John held his breath, his heart racing in his chest as he waited, listening for the telltale signs of their enemies closing in. The roar of engines grew louder, the headlights piercing the darkness as the pursuing vehicles sped past, their drivers unaware of the hidden entrance to the quarry. For a brief moment, it felt like they had escaped, but John knew better. This wasn't over. Not yet. Elaine killed the engine, her breathing heavy as she glanced back at John and David. "We bought ourselves a little time," she said softly, "but they'll figure it out soon enough." John's mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. They were running out of options, out of time. The powerful people chasing them wouldn't stop until they were dead, or worse. And now, here they were, hiding in a dark quarry, with nothing but a broken SUV and the weight of secrets threatening to crush them all. David reloaded his gun, his face grim. "We can't stay here long. Once they realize we've stopped, they'll come back. And when they do, it's going to be bad." Elaine nodded, her face pale but determined. "We'll make our stand here," she said quietly. "We don't have a choice." John's pulse quickened as the reality of their situation settled over him like a suffocating fog. This was it, the final stretch, the climax of everything they'd been running from. And now, as the sound of distant engines echoed in the night, he knew the real danger was just beginning. The silence in the quarry felt unnatural, almost like the calm before a storm. John could sense it, the tension in the air, the unshakable feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. He glanced over at Elaine, who was gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. David was crouched low, his eyes scanning the darkness, waiting for the inevitable return of their enemies. Every second felt like an eternity, the air heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. Then, just as John thought they might have a moment to regroup, something unexpected happened. A soft vibration hummed through the floor of the SUV. At first, John thought it was just his imagination, but when he glanced at David, he saw the same realization dawning on his face. The ground beneath them wasn't just shaking, it was moving. "What the hell?" David muttered, his voice tight with alarm. Elaine frowned, confusion clouding her features. "It's the quarry," she said, her voice low. "There's been seismic activity here before, but nothing this serious. It feels like the whole place is shifting." John's heart skipped a beat. They were sitting on unstable ground, and if the earth gave way beneath them, they wouldn't just be trapped, they'd be buried alive. Panic surged through him as the vibrations grew stronger, the sound of rocks crumbling echoing in the cavernous space. "We need to get out of here," John said, his voice sharp with urgency. "Now." But before anyone could move, the sound of engines returned, louder this time, accompanied by the unmistakable screech of tires. Their pursuers were back, and they weren't wasting any time. The dark quarry, once their hiding place, was about to become a battleground. And now, with the ground itself shifting beneath their feet, the stakes had just skyrocketed. David cursed under his breath and tightened his grip on his gun. "They've found us. We can't outrun them this time." Elaine's face was pale, but her eyes were fierce. "Then we'll have to outsmart them," she said, her voice steely. "Nathaniel built this place for more than just hiding. There are tunnels, hidden passages that lead to other parts of the property. If we can get to one, we might have a chance." John didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. Every time they seemed to find a way out, something new and dangerous loomed over them, but the way Elaine spoke, with such certainty, gave him a sliver of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they had a chance to escape. Before they could act on her plan, though, another twist hit them out of nowhere. The headlights from the approaching vehicles flickered for a moment, then suddenly cut off. The quarry plunged into darkness, so complete that John could barely see his hand in front of his face. It wasn't just the vehicles, the whole area had lost power. The low hum of machinery they hadn't even noticed before disappeared, leaving an eerie, oppressive silence. David's voice broke through the dark, tense and confused. "What just happened?" Elaine's expression shifted from determination to something else, something like fear. "This isn't a blackout. This is deliberate," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're trying to box us in, control the environment. They've been planning this all along." John's pulse raced as the full weight of her words sank in. It wasn't just a chase anymore. Whoever was after them wasn't just powerful. They were meticulous, calculating. They had anticipated every move, every escape route, and now, with the power cut and the ground unstable, they had John, Elaine, and David exactly where they wanted them. Suddenly, a single flashlight beam cut through the dark, swinging wildly as someone approached. It wasn't from one of the vehicles, and it wasn't one of the thugs that had been chasing them. The light moved erratically, like whoever was holding it was panicked, lost. "Who's that?" John asked, squinting to see. Elaine frowned, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't know." David raised his gun, his eyes narrowing as he tried to get a clearer view. Could be a trap. But before they could decide, the figure behind the flashlight stumbled into view, a tall, gaunt man with disheveled hair and clothes that looked as though he'd been living underground for days. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror, and as he came closer, John could see that he wasn't holding a weapon. He was clutching a folder, its pages spilling out in the wind. "Help me," the man gasped, his voice hoarse and desperate. "They're coming. They're coming for all of us." Elaine's eyes widened in shock, recognition flashing across her face. "You," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You're one of Nathaniel's old partners. What are you doing here?" The man staggered forward, his breathing labored as if he'd been running for hours. "They found out," he said, his voice shaking, "about everything. The deals, the money, the files. I thought I could hide, but they found me. They're cleaning house, getting rid of anyone who knows too much. You're next." John felt the ground shift beneath him again, but this time it wasn't just the quarry. It was the weight of the truth crashing down on them. This wasn't just about Nathaniel's death. It was bigger than that. There was a massive cover-up in play, and the people behind it were ruthless, willing to kill anyone who could expose them. And now, John realized, they were caught in the middle of it. Before they could process what was happening, another set of headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. This time, it wasn't their pursuers. It was something else. A sleek, black car, far too polished and clean to belong to the thugs chasing them. It stopped at the entrance to the quarry, and for a long moment, no one moved. Then, a figure stepped out, tall and poised, dressed in a sharp suit. The man moved with a calm, deliberate grace, as if he wasn't the least bit concerned about the chaos surrounding him. He didn't say a word, but the silence he brought with him was more terrifying than anything John had faced so far. Elaine's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as she recognized him. "It's him," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "the man who gave the order to kill Nathaniel." John's heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there and face this man. But he was frozen, trapped by the realization that they were no longer just running for their lives. They were about to confront the person behind everything. The man's cold gaze swept over them, calculating and cruel. He said nothing, but his mere presence sent a chill through the air, making it clear that whatever came next would change everything. John knew, in that moment, that they were out of time. The final confrontation was coming, and it would determine whether they lived or died. The tension in the air was so thick, John could barely breathe. The man in the suit stood before them, calm and controlled, like a predator that knew its prey was already cornered. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rumble of the unstable quarry and the low hum of the man's car still running behind him. The faint light from the headlights cast long shadows over the group, making everything feel surreal, like a nightmare they couldn't wake from. Elaine was the first to speak, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Why? Why did you do it?" She stood tall, but John could see her hands trembling at her sides. "Nathaniel trusted you. He built everything with you, and you hadn't killed." The man's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked almost amused by her defiance. "Nathaniel trusted too easily," he said smoothly, his voice cold. He didn't see the bigger picture. He thought money was power, but real power is control. Control of the narrative, control of people like you. He flicked his gaze over to John and David, dismissing them as if they were insignificant in the grand scheme of things. John felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. Everything they'd been through, the death threats, the chase, the constant fear, it all led back to this man, and he acted like they were nothing more than pawns in his game. He clenched his fists, trying to keep his emotions in check, but it was David who spoke next. "Is that why you're here?" David growled, his voice low and dangerous. "To finish the job. Tie up loose ends." The man's lips curled into a slight smile. In a manner of speaking, he said, "Loose ends are dangerous. Nathaniel's death was supposed to be the end of it, but then, he glanced at Elaine, had to dig deeper. And now here we are." John's heart pounded in his chest as the realization sank in. This man had orchestrated everything. He was behind Nathaniel's murder, the chase, the attempt to cover it all up. And now he was standing right in front of them, cool and collected, as if he held all the cards. But John knew there was something this man hadn't accounted for: Elaine's determination, her willingness to fight for the truth. And that made her more dangerous than he realized. Elaine took a step forward, her eyes locked on the man's. "You're wrong," she said softly, but there was steel in her voice. "Nathaniel might have trusted you, but he wasn't a fool. He knew something was wrong. That's why he left me the files. He knew you'd come after him, and he made sure I'd be ready when you did." For the first time, the man's confident facade flickered, just for a second. His eyes narrowed slightly, and John saw a flash of uncertainty. "What files?" Elaine smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that told John she had planned for this moment. "The files that detail every illegal deal, every offshore account, every connection you've made to keep your empire running. It's all in there. And I've made sure they're in the right hands." The man's face hardened, the cold mask slipping back into place. "You're bluffing," he said. There was a sharp edge to his voice now. "If you had that kind of leverage, you wouldn't be running. You wouldn't be hiding in a quarry, waiting for me to find you." Elaine's smile didn't waver. "I wasn't running," she said quietly. "I was leading you here. You see, Nathaniel didn't just leave me files. He left me instructions. He knew what you'd do, and he made sure there was a plan in place for when you finally showed your face." John's pulse quickened as Elaine's words sunk in. This wasn't just a desperate escape. This was part of a plan Nathaniel had put in motion long before his death. He had anticipated every move, every betrayal, and had prepared Elaine to confront the man who had orchestrated it all. The man in the suit tensed, his calm demeanor beginning to crack. "You don't understand what you're playing with," he said, his voice low and threatening. "This isn't a game. People like me, we don't lose. We don't let people like you win." Elaine stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "You already lost." In that instant, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The distant wail of police cars grew louder, cutting through the silence of the quarry like a knife. The man's eyes flicked toward the entrance, and John could see the realization dawning on him. They were surrounded. There was no way out. John exchanged a glance with David, who was already lowering his gun, the tension finally easing from his body. It was over. The man in the suit, so sure of his control, had walked right into the trap that Nathaniel had set from beyond the grave. But just as the relief began to settle in, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath them shook again, harder this time, and a loud crack echoed through the quarry. John barely had time to react before the rock formations around them began to crumble. The seismic activity that had been building was finally reaching its breaking point. "Get out of here!" David shouted, grabbing John's arm as chunks of rock began to fall from above. The police sirens were getting closer, but the ground was collapsing too fast. John stumbled, grabbing onto Elaine as they made a mad dash for the exit. Behind them, the man in the suit was shouting, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the earth collapsing around him. For a brief moment, John saw the man standing there, defiant to the end, as the ground gave way beneath him, swallowing him into the depths of the quarry. John, Elaine, and David barely made it out in time, the world behind them collapsing into dust and rubble. They stumbled into the open air, breathless and shaken, as the first police cars pulled up to the scene. The flashing lights illuminated the devastation behind them, and for a moment, no one spoke. The quarry had taken its final victim, and with it, the secrets of a man who had believed he was untouchable. Elaine stood in the cool night air, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths, the weight of everything that had happened settling over her. John placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft but steady. "It's over." But Elaine shook her head, her eyes still fixed on the wreckage of the quarry. "No," she said quietly, her voice filled with a strange sense of finality. "It's just beginning." John didn't understand at first, but then he saw it, the flicker of something deeper in her eyes. The files, the power they contained, weren't just about bringing down one man. They were about uncovering something far bigger, something that would shake the very foundations of everything Nathaniel had built. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The night was cool, a stark contrast to the tension that had filled the air just moments before. John, Elaine, and David stood outside the crumbling quarry, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The flashing lights of the police cars lit up their faces, casting long shadows over the scene. The noise of officers shouting orders and the rumble of the earth settling behind them filled the air, but for the first time, it felt distant, like it belonged to a different world. Elaine turned away from the wreckage, her expression unreadable. John could see the weight of everything they had been through etched in the lines of her face, but there was something else there too, a resolve, a quiet determination that told him this wasn't the end of her fight. She had won this battle, but he knew the war was far from over. David stood by, watching the police and emergency responders swarm the area. His usually sharp eyes were softer now, reflecting the toll the night had taken on him. He holstered his gun, letting out a long breath. "It's done," he muttered, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself. John nodded, glancing back at the quarry one last time. The man in the suit, their enemy, was gone, swallowed by the earth along with the secrets he had tried so hard to protect. For a moment, John felt a strange sense of satisfaction, knowing that justice had been served, even if it hadn't come in the way they expected. But there was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Just a hall of silence, as if the victory came at a cost too high to fully grasp. Elaine finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "Nathaniel didn't die in vain," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. "He knew what would happen, and he made sure we had what we needed to take them down. But this is just the beginning. There are more out there, people like him, powerful people who think they can control everything and everyone." John didn't argue. He could see the truth in her words. The files that Nathaniel had left behind weren't just a weapon against one man. They were a key to exposing an entire network of corruption. The man in the suit had been a piece of a much larger puzzle, and now that he was gone, the others would come looking for answers. The fight wasn't over, and John knew Elaine wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the full truth. "Are you sure you want to keep going?" John asked, his voice tinged with concern. "This could get dangerous. More dangerous than it already is." Elaine looked at him, her eyes fierce and unyielding. "I don't have a choice," she said. "Nathaniel trusted me with this. He trusted me to finish what he started. If I walk away now, everything we went through, everything he sacrificed, will mean nothing." John wanted to argue, to tell her that she had done enough, that no one would blame her for walking away after all she had endured. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Elaine wasn't the type to back down, not when there was still a fight to be fought. David stepped forward, his voice calmer than it had been all night. "We'll figure it out," he said. "We'll take it one step at a time. The files are safe, and we have the police on our side now. We're not alone in this anymore." Elaine gave him a small nod, but John could see the weariness in her eyes. She wasn't naive. She knew that having the files didn't mean they were safe. It meant they were a threat, and there would be more people coming after them, more danger around every corner. But even so, she didn't waver. The police officers approached them, asking for statements, trying to piece together the events that had led to the collapse of the quarry. Elaine answered their questions with calm precision, giving just enough information without revealing the full extent of what they had uncovered. John and David backed her up, knowing that the less the authorities knew for now, the better. As the night wore on, the adrenaline that had been keeping John going began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming exhaustion. The gravity of everything that had happened weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he allowed himself to think about what came next. The immediate danger was over, but the road ahead was uncertain. There would be more enemies, more challenges, and more secrets to uncover. When the police finally let them go, the three of them walked back to their car in silence. The cool night air felt like a balm on John's skin, a reminder that they had survived, at least for now. As they climbed into the vehicle, Elaine turned to look at John, her expression softening for the first time since the night had begun. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything." John shrugged, feeling awkward under the weight of her gratitude. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, though he knew that wasn't entirely true. Most people would have walked away long before things got this dangerous, but something had kept him there, something more than just a sense of duty. He couldn't explain it, but he knew that he was in this for the long haul now, just like Elaine. As they drove away from the quarry, the sky beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn, John felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The worst was behind them, but the future still held countless unknowns. But for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. Elaine leaned back in her seat, her eyes drifting closed as exhaustion finally caught up with her. "We're going to finish this," she murmured, half asleep. "We're going to make sure they can never hurt anyone else again." John glanced over at her, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah," he said softly, "we will." The car moved steadily down the empty road, the world around them quiet and still, as if holding its breath for what was to come. The fight wasn't over, but in that moment, John knew they had already won the most important battle, the one that gave them the strength to keep going. And as the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon, casting a warm glow over the landscape, John allowed himself to hope. Hope that this time they would not only survive but win. For Nathaniel, for Elaine, and for everyone who had ever been caught in the web of corruption they were about to tear down.